Good afternoon, Cooper. Good afternoon, Jimmy. How are you both doing? You can just text me your responses in the chat box. Hello, Hayden. How are you? So we'll wait a few minutes till everybody shows up, and then we can get started. Hello, Mr. Zenar. Hello, Mr. Lucier.
Hey, Mr. G, how are you?
Great. So what I thought we could do is once people get logged in, I could start with a prayer, and then after that we could touch base with the scenarios, or do you want to maybe speak about your experience first and then talk about the scenarios, or whatever you feel? I feel like you had a good game plan. Oop. All right, I had you on mute. Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I did unmute myself. I have one outside of kind of just a refresher to kind of like get the kids thinking a little bit.
And by the way, I'm recording the session if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Yeah, I think once we get a little bit of a discussion going, I'll recap the sheet kind of briefly, talk a little bit about the scenarios, and then kind of talk a little bit about my own experience, and then hopefully have some time for the questions at the end.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well. I'm going to get us started because I want to keep your time. So let's start with a little prayer. And if you wouldn't mind, if you have a prayer intention that you'd like to share with everybody, go ahead and type that into the chat box. So if there's something on your mind or on your heart that you'd like us to pray for today, go ahead and just type that out. But let's just take a moment of quiet. Let's begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear God, cast forth the shadow of your cross over peoples at war. May they learn the way of reconciliation, dialogue, and forgiveness. Let the peoples so wearied by bombing experience the joy of your resurrection. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Okay. Would you like me to share my screen with the different scenarios that you put up, or you want to say a few words about yourself first?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit first. Do you have is there like a raise hand function, or do you guys mostly go through the chat? Should I keep my eye on the chat?
I'd say go through the chat function. That's what
Great. So I don't see many names that I remember from last year. But good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mr. Lucier. I was an ASC there at SLU High last year, so I might have run into a couple of you. I was in the English department. More relevant to today, I myself am a SLU High grad, and immediately after graduating in 2008, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. So I was an 0311 infantry rifleman, which is kind of the building block infantry unit of the Marine Corps. In that capacity, I went around the world for 5 years. I was with an anti-terrorism and security team for my first 2 years. So I was in Guantanamo Bay in 2009. I spent some time in Spain, went to Israel for a little bit, and then went to the American Embassy in Bahrain for the Arab Spring, which is the large kind of revolutions that happened in a lot of different countries, including Bahrain. After my time with the anti-terrorism and security team, I joined a regular infantry unit, First Line Armored Reconnaissance. And with them, I deployed to Afghanistan in 2011. And that's where a lot of those scenarios that you saw and hopefully read last night came from, largely from kind of my own experience. I've been writing and talking about those experiences and faith and what it means to be Catholic and what it means to serve and how we can kind of reconcile those two things since I got out in 2013. And then I went to college. I studied political science and international relations, and then I came to teach English here at SLU High. And now I'm in law school at SLU Law, so I'm still here in St. Louis. So what I would like to do to start, I don't know what SLU High's rules are. Do we say keep the cameras off, or is it okay if we turn them on? I can't hear you, Mr. G, you're muted.
I'm not sure about that. I thought it would be okay if we turn them on, but I don't know what the rules are, to be honest.
If you feel comfortable, if you don't mind, I would love to see faces. I think it's a really important part of this conversation. If you're like a mess or if you've got crazy stuff going on at your house, don't worry about it so much. But
yeah, but I think for the most part they can, unless I screwed up the settings. But yeah.
Yeah, great. Hey, we got one brave one. What's up, guys? How are we all doing? It's okay. Today's the first time I put on like people clothes, and I did it just for you. All right, we're all getting through this quarantine together. I love a tuxedo.
Wait a minute, I've got a guest speaker on my end too. My son, Anthony Garavai. There you go.
How you guys doing?
Hey, Anthony, how's it
Ready
going?
to watch the show.
All right. Hey guys, welcome to Zoom. Yeah, just for now, keep it on mute unless I like talk to you or point to you. Okay. What I would like to do first, so we're assuming you all did the reading, and I'm sure you guys did because you're all great SLU High students.
Well,
so we're gonna get
one thing for sure is that they had the reading about the just war tradition yesterday, and then they got your scenarios today. So today they just got the scenarios, so they may not have done the scenarios, but they did do the just war reading.
That's all right. That is okay. So,
would you like me to, and if you want me to put share the screen with the scenarios, I can post them up too if that's helpful. Whatever you need.
Yeah, sure. We'll get there in a second.
Okay.
The first thing I want to do is hopefully you have something to write with in front of you. Let's take a minute and think about this question to kind of ground ourselves in the material. And we'll split into two groups to write two different questions. So let's see, Andrew, Jack, Cooper, James, Hayden, and Jimmy. I want you to think about this question. Given the reading that you did, talk a little bit on your own view. When is it okay for a country to go to war? When is it okay for a country to use force? Let's make it a little more specific. When is it okay for a country to use force? And just so that we're not using euphemisms, let's talk about what force is. I had to memorize this as a Marine. So that force which a person uses with the purpose of causing death or serious bodily harm, or which a reasonable and prudent person would consider likely to create a substantial risk of causing death or serious bodily harm. When is it okay to hurt someone? When is it okay for the state to exercise violence? Take about 2 minutes. Write down what scenarios or what hypotheticals, when would you think that's okay? Will, Hayden, Mr. Bellini in the Tux, Charlie, H. Aiden, Jack, Sam, Owen, Aiden, and Andrew M. Rather than when it's okay for a country to use force, think about when it would be okay for you as an individual to use force. Under what circumstances would you feel comfortable intervening in a situation and using force, right? Pushing someone, right? Or even a more drastic scenario, using some kind of force. Under what scenario would you feel like that might be just? Not as a country, but as a person. Take about 2 minutes, write down those, think about it, and we'll come back, all right? I'm gonna do one myself. Think a little bit about it. Uh-oh. Maybe another 30 seconds. Alrighty. What's great about Zoom is I get to see all of your names. So maybe from the first group, maybe a volunteer. Did you come up with anything? Like Cooper, James, Hayden, Jimmy, Jack? Unmute yourself. I think we can do this civilly. Hayden, yeah.
I said as a person, I think the only responsible times to use force would be to defend myself or save someone else from grave danger or risk after all peaceful options are already exhausted.
Okay, so you touched on two things there. So these were also things I had to memorize. So if you've got notes and you feel like learning about Marine Corps doctrine, we talk about 7 justifications for the use of deadly force. And then we talk about 3 kind of like circumstances. You touched on 2 out of the 7. The first one is self-defense or defense of others. And then to prevent or stop serious crimes against persons. So in self-defense or defense of others is kind of a classic justification for use of force, right? We're allowed to protect ourselves and to prevent or interrupt serious crimes against persons. So if you see someone who maybe is being threatened or some kind of assault going on, like certainly that would be kind of a classic justification. The circumstances that we talk about are extreme necessity, last resort, and all lesser means have failed or cannot be reasonably employed. Extreme necessity, last resort, and all lesser means have failed. So under one of those justification scenarios, right, in self-defense or defense of others, I still have to go through my 3-step process, right? Like if someone's trying to hurt me, there still has to be an extreme need. So if someone's trying to hurt me, but they're very, very far away from me and they can't really do that, there's no necessity there, right? Last resort, I have to try and do other things first. The classic example of that, we call it shout, shove, show, shoot, right? So shout, like, hey, stop what you're doing. Shove, like try and use something that's less than absolutely like lethal force. Show, demonstrate your willingness to exercise force, deadly force. And then finally, once you're through all that, shoot, right? Extreme necessity, last resort, all lesser means have failed or cannot be reasonably employed. You hit kind of 2 of the justifications. Who else in that first group? You kind of talked about an individual, and that's great, Hayden. But who talked about what a state might do, or what we call like a country? James or Cooper or Jimmy? You write down any examples? Yeah, James.
Yeah, I did. I wrote, I gave 4 examples. I said when all other avenues have been exhausted, peaceful avenues. all attempts at peace have been tried, or where the people are oppressed or the rights of the people are challenged by another group.
The rights of the people being challenged by another group. I think that's a really interesting thing. Talk a little bit more about what you mean by that.
I just mean like if a population is kind of being impressed upon, oppressed in some way, that is out of their control, maybe by another population, another country, nation, group of people, that they can't defend themselves, then I would say that it's almost a form of self-defense. Or if another country has to intervene, it's self-defense. Well, not self-defense, but defending their rights on their behalf.
Yeah, that's great, James. So you actually present kind of two really interesting and from an international law standpoint, really distinct scenarios, right? The first one is if a nation, right, is the victim of aggression by another nation, right? So this is Germany invades Poland in 1939. Much more recently, Iraq invades Kuwait in 1991, right? Both instances, we see international coalitions coming together to enforce international laws about non-aggression, right? It is illegal for a state to try and force another state to do something. When I say state in international law, that means a country, okay, a nation. There's a separate scenario, though, that's really vexing for both international law and morality purposes, right? And that's when it's entirely internal. So in Rwanda in 1993, right, we see one people, one population, which you said, right, oppressing another population. And whether or not a state, the United States, the European Union, the African Union, Egypt, other countries in that area can intervene has been proven really difficult from a legal perspective. If you're really interested in these kind of things, you can look up something called responsibility to protect, R2P. And that's the international framework under which we're trying to think about if a state can interfere with the sovereignty of another state. Because for the most part, we like sovereignty. States should be able to do whatever they want to within their own borders, at least from a legal perspective, maybe not a moral one. And so for a state to terminate the sovereignty of another state, it's a pretty serious deal. China said, hey, United States, you're particularly oppressive towards people of color, towards women, and we're going to intervene with force. We would certainly find that offensive to our notions of traditional fair play and justice and typical sovereignty, right? That could be a really slippery slope if countries start intervening in other countries. On the other hand, we see really horrible examples of genocide, right? Where we really, our moral intuitions tell us like someone ought to intervene in this situation and force might be justified. But from a moral and legal perspective, the rights of the people being infringed is a really kind of difficult question. So it's a great answer, James, and it's something that we're working with a lot. From the second group of people, how about you guys, individuals? Let's see, names. I got Hayden down there, Mr. Alex, Sam, Jack Peel, Aiden. Who's my talker down there? You can, yeah, Hayden. When's it okay for you, maybe, in a situation you might find yourself in your own life?
I just said I thought it was okay for an individual to use force when their basic human rights are being threatened or when they're in direct danger or facing something that can cause them harm.
When they're in direct danger, like when something could cause them direct harm, there's something about that threat has to be immediate, right? It needs to, right? It has to be close. And that can be a hard thing. That's like a judgment call, right? Absolutely. When that is close enough. And it can be difficult in some of the situations that we're going to look at. So I like that. How about someone else from the bottom? It's in the bottom in my gallery view. I don't know if your views are the same as mine. From the second group of people, did I see a hand, Will, or are you just scratching your nose? Will Hudson.
Yeah. Here.
Chime on in here, bud.
So for what I said, it's similar to Hayden's, but I said it would be okay as an individual to use force in self-defense when one is initiated by an aggressor with the intention to put our physical well-being or life in jeopardy.
So the initial aggressor thing is interesting. And I'm a law student, so I know about initial aggressor rules in criminal law. So from a legal perspective, interesting. Like, right? So if I started the fight, right, and maybe I pushed or I shoved or I punched, but now someone has escalated that, right? We talk about escalation of force in the Marine Corps and what that means. We try and like put codification and frameworks onto these things. So we talk about like 5 levels and what our possible responses are. These were things I had to memorize. Like force was very, very doctrinal. It was how you think about it. So we talked about the 5 states of the person who's confronting me and what I'm allowed to do. Those were, let's see if I can, compliant, cooperative. If someone's compliant and cooperative, I just issue verbal commands. If they're resistant, passive, so I tell you to do something and you don't do it, I try and use contact controls, which means mostly like I try and get in contact with you, not put my hands on you, right? Because if I'm saying something to you and you're not responding to it, I'm not in contact with you. Like, we're not communicating, and I need to establish that. And in a place where sometimes you guys don't think about this, but I was in Afghanistan, the people didn't speak the same language. There's no subtitles in war, right? When that Afghan person is speaking Pashto at me, or maybe Baluch, or maybe Dari, there's many different languages in southern Afghanistan. You know, even my limited Pashto, like, they might not even speak that. If I tell them the words that I knew, like Plarnum, what's your father's name, or Za, or, you know, like, get on the ground, take your shirt off, the kind of things that we had to learn, I might not be in contact with that person. So they're resistant passive. We talk about resistant active and using compliance techniques. We talk about they're trying to cause me harm and using defensive tactics, and then they're trying to cause me serious bodily harm and death. So that escalation is kind of an interesting thing. And then the initial aggressor, like, if someone escalates, at what point am I then allowed and okay, even if I started the fight, I didn't pull a gun out, but now this person is threatening me with a knife. Can I, even though I started the fight, can I respond with a gun? Is that okay? Is it legal? Is it moral? What's my moral culpability? So it's a lot of interesting things. How about someone else from the bottom? When is it okay for maybe you, maybe something that's like more relevant to you guys in your life? I don't know. Hopefully none of you are getting in fights. Any other hands? When it's okay as an individual to use force. Let's hear from one more. One brave soul.
I can go.
Ben Renner in your old Trucker Bill hat. Is that a Trucker Bill Sluhai hat? Absolutely. I've got one too. Ben, tell me what you think. Ben, you got to unmute yourself, brother.
Boop. There we go. Sorry. I would say it's okay to use force only when, like, in a self-defense kind of way. Like, for instance, at our school, we had, in like grade school, there were a lot of people that tended to like be very aggressive towards one another, and they didn't really like, they just picked fights for no reason. But there were some people that like use self-defense by like pushing them away, or like maybe even like not starting the fight, but like fighting back. So I feel like it's okay then, but when it comes out of self-defense, like when they are subdued, then you shouldn't use force afterwards just to get rage out.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about that towards the end, about in wartime, like, when does violence stop being okay? If it was okay originally, when does it stop being okay? Like, what am I trying to achieve through violence? And if that goal has been achieved, how do I know it's been achieved? How do I measure that? And then when do I stop, right? In an individual level, certainly, like, you know, if someone else started a fight, but I win it, when do I need to stop swinging, right? That's a moral question, right? Something that's hard. In wartime, it's really serious. As we're going to see in one of the scenarios, what does it mean for a person to be subdued? And how do I know, right? It's kind of an epistemological question. How do I know? How do I know any of these things? And what's it going to look like in real life? Thanks to you guys for your thoughts. I think that gives us a really great place to start. So hopefully you have in front of you, Mr. G can maybe share the screen that has the scenarios, but maybe that first page that has some kind of general principles on it. And if you have it on your own, maybe you can do it that way. Just pull up that sheet. It should say ethical scenarios, but the first page is going to have a bunch of like Latin gobbledygook that's very similar to what you read in your reading. It's kind of my distillation of it versus the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Beautiful. Yeah, we've got it. So let's go over real quick just some of these things on here. And I mentioned some of them in the talk, and you really don't need to know for your purposes a ton of detail here, but it's interesting to kind of go over. So we're broadly talking about two categories when we talk about like just war theory. And we're going to talk about nonviolence, right? So our first fork in the road is two Catholic approaches to war and to force, right? And we have our nonviolent tradition, and that's a whole branch, and that's a whole tree over here. I'm kind of firmly in that camp now for reasons that we'll talk about. But there's another moral framework for thinking about force, and that's this just war theory. And then from that just war theory, we can kind of branch off into kind of two further subparts, right? We can talk about justice in going to war, when it's okay to start a war, and then right behavior in war. So kind of jus ad bellum, justice in going to war for my Latin scholars out there. And then jus in bello, I don't know why the end of the word changes, for what how we ought to behave once we're at war. And that's really where my experience lies. Just for your edification, really quick, there's kind of 5 general principles. The Catholic Bishops' Conference structures it a little differently. Obviously, you need proper authority. So I talked about states earlier. We really want to confine the use of force to states. In international law theory, we talk about states have a monopoly on violence, both inside and outside their own borders, right? So why this matters, can a group like Al-Qaeda have a just war? Any hands out there? If you need a proper authority and public declaration, can a group like Al-Qaeda, can a group like Hamas, can a group like the Irish Republican Army, right? Do they have proper authority to publicly declare and start a war? What do you think? You can just shake your head yes or shake your head no. Yeah, generally not, right? We need a state. We need a state in order to go to war. So we really want to prevent kind of non-state actors from starting wars for just a whole bunch of reasons. Just cause, right intention. Someone has to have violated someone else's sovereignty. Someone has to be oppressing someone. There has to be some kind of good, moral, legal reason in order to start a war. In the build up to Iraq, we kind of talked about 4 general ideas: invading another country, messing around with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, harboring international terrorists, and then genocide. All 4 of which Saddam Hussein had kind of done in the lead up to the Iraq War. Why it was or wasn't just is a totally different reason, but that just cause and right intention, there's lots of different frameworks to think about it, but those are some reasons why you might think like, okay, this is a good to go to war. Someone's committing genocide. Someone is trying to develop nuclear weapons, which we kind of recognize as a particularly bad and evil thing. Harboring terrorists or murderous criminals, and refusing to cooperate with international justice systems. And then obviously invading another country. The probability of success, don't start a war if you can't finish a war. It's important. Proportionality, only use that force which you actually need to use in order to achieve your objective. You guys know about the doctrine of double effect, I think, maybe from your morality classes. Yes, I see heads shaking, yeah. So anytime you use force, it's going to affect non-combatants. There is no perfect use of force. Innocent people will always be hurt. And so we want to minimize the use of force whenever necessary under a just war theory. And then as a last resort, obviously you have to try and do other things first. Questions about justice in going to war, jus ad bellum principles. Did you guys read about it? Any general questions or thoughts you might have? You guys have been at war your whole life. You guys, this is the first class I think I've ever taught where all of you were born after September 11th, correct? Yeah, okay. So here's one quick thought scenario for justice in going to war, and then we'll move on. So this is a topical, hopefully you guys remember recently, well, maybe, oh man, it might've been 2017. This might've been a bit good. We launched some missile strikes against Syria. I don't know if you guys remember this. Do you? We blew up an airstrip. It was all over the news. Take a minute and think about, according to those kind of 5 things right there, right? Those 5 just war principles. What's your opinion on the morality, according to the just war theory, of kind of limited strikes against, I don't know how much you know about the Syria situation, but there's a large civil war going on. It seems like there's some pretty targeted killings by the regime against innocent persons, kind of widespread starvation. And the precipitating event was a chemical gas attack. So the regime actually unleashed some gas against some folks and caused really pretty horrific damage. And President Trump responded by launching what are called TLAMs, Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles, off some missile destroyers. Take 1 minute, real quick, tell yourself, is this a just use of war according to jus ad bellum theory?
And why don't you just type in your response in the chat.
Yeah.
So go ahead and type it, and I'll take off the sharing so we can see each other's.
Sure.
Another way to frame your response too might be in the chat, just type if you think it is the moral thing to do or not, and then which one of those 5 do you think criteria is that it meet?
I'm having some technology issues on my end. I apologize. So think about that and oh, good. We got some answers coming in. Stand up for the oppressed, not just the obsessed. It's morally okay. Yeah, an interesting point to Aiden as he comes in and keep typing your responses. You're kind of looking at the consequences. They didn't kill any civilians. They actually didn't kill any Syrian soldiers either, or Russians who were actually at the same base. But we can't necessarily know that going in, so that's something to think about, right? They didn't intend to, but could it have happened? Response to an attack on the innocent. That's true, although some people would call the Syrian rebels. And governments certainly have a right to defend themselves. So just to push back, I don't necessarily think that's true, but it's a difficult analysis. Justified from Hayden? No one thinks not so, huh? A bit more research on what led up to the decision. I like that answer, Andrew M. And here's a hint for you, Andrew. Where are you? Let me see your face. Andrew M. Maybe he's on the other one. Ask for the TikTok. You always want to ask for the TikTok. It's what a White House releases after it does one of these things. And it's kind of a literal minute by minute of what happened with the president. Typically you get those a couple afterwards. That's a little Washington inside baseball, but always look for the TikTok and it'll give you some interesting thoughts. Jack Rutter thinks it was morally justified. I think the missile strike was justified. Just use of war, just cause given the horrible situation. Interesting. Okay. So a lot of folks think so. I think that's really interesting. I think your generation has a really interesting approach to violence because you've been exposed to it for so long. I think kind of targeted bombings would have raised a lot more eyebrows, say for Mr. G or for myself pre 9/11. But it seems to be kind of the norm now. We're used to seeing Navy SEALs kicking in doors and killing folks. We're used to kind of targeted drone strikes in places like Yemen. That's been your whole life. You've grappled with these things. It hasn't been mine. It wasn't until I was about 12 years old that the United States exercising violence kind of all over the world was the norm. And then I was kind of at the tip of that violence for a while, and it's informed where I am now. So I'm not gonna, I'll try and be generally objective, but hopefully I can pull some of you towards thinking a little more deeply about some of these things and remind you of kind of the consequences of what it means that America has been doing this for so long. For 20 years now, we've been kind of striking indiscriminately around the world. So Mr. G, if you could pull up the ethical scenarios, if you would. So the next part, so that's great work. I think you guys are kind of grasp the principles, at least generally. You guys have a general idea, and I would hope so, as just moral imaginers, that our moral imaginations typically kind of serve us well in these situations, right? What you think sounds like the right thing to do typically is going to fall roughly within just war principles when we're talking about hypotheticals. It's in the details that things get much, much more difficult. I'm going to try and pull this up on my end, but my actual computer, not my laptop with this, tends to freeze. So I'm going to hopefully either work off my own computer or the screen if it's being shared. So we're going to work through these kind of one by one. So we've gone through what it means in going to war, but again, justice in war, what you do as a soldier on the ground can be really, really difficult in the moment, and your decisions can really affect lives. So again, you should have copies of these. You can see it on Mr. G's screen, but let's walk through them and we'll kind of do them all together and give you some time to think about them, and then I can ask you what happened. So our first one, again, this is imagine yourself, and let's just say, put yourself in my shoes. So this was Afghanistan. It was in 2011. All right. But they're pretty generally applicable. These scenarios pop up in war all the time. So the first one. I'm going to take one step back before we jump into these. If you can scroll up real quick. So here's the 4 things I want you thinking about as we go through these. So we talked about 5 things for going to war. Think about these 4 things during war. 4 principles. Distinction. It's important for soldiers to make distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, right? You have to try and make sure that who you're directing force towards is actually a combatant. We talk about like positive ID and positive threat, right? That person, you see who they actually are, and they're actually doing something, some kind of harmful act, or they have a harmful intent towards you. You have to make those distinctions. Proportionality. You can only use the force that's necessary to win that particular gunfight, right? You can't drop a JDAM on a single family home because a kid, some goat farmer, 12-year-old, took a pot shot at you with an AK. It's just not okay, right? You have to respond, even if that means putting yourself in danger. I can't call for a bomb out of a KC like 135 or an A10 to make a gun run just because some kid decided to take a couple shots at US Marines. We had to rush into that situation and try and identify a specific threat because we were only allowed to use so much force. Proportionality, even if it means putting yourself in greater danger. That's part of the morality of what's required of a professional soldier, particularly one in the United States. Accountability. We have to hold professional soldiers accountable for their actions. None of these principles mean anything if you can't end up in front of a trial court at the end of it, right? So we can talk about distinction and proportionality all we want, but there have to be consequences for breaking these things. International Court of Criminal Justice, United States military tribunals. And then the rights of soldiers. It's kind of a corollary to proportionality and to distinction, but we bring it in. So once a soldier has stopped being a soldier, they have to be treated humanely. And then when they're kept in prison camps and they're prisoners of war, there are certain principles that follow. Those guys have to be treated in certain ways, mostly according to like Vienna and the Geneva Conventions. Okay? Those 4 principles: distinction, proportionality, accountability, and the rights of soldiers. Take those into these scenarios. The first one is difficult, and again, this is a real thing. Okay, so you're on a patrol. It's a high threat environment. There's IEDs everywhere. They're typically buried, and you guys miss one, and it hits hard, and you lose a guy. So the guy in front of you in the patrol steps on that pressure plate IED and is killed instantly by so many pounds of homemade explosive. Okay. You do what's your standard operating procedure in this, right? You quickly form like a cordon, so a circle around the blast site to kind of protect it from anyone else who's trying to attack you in case there's a complex ambush, and also to create a security barrier so that you can get a helicopter in to retrieve the casualty, either the wounded person or in this case, the dead body. And you don't know where further threats are going to come from. So you establish that 360-degree cordon. and you're waiting for reinforcements to arrive at your position because you've been compromised, and obviously people are upset. They're not going to be tactically ready to handle situations, so you want to get reinforcements there right away. There's 2 hills nearby, and you've previously been shot at them from them before, so this is a high risk area. You are not in a good security posture, and you don't have any indirect fire or air on station. Your particular sector of fire as an individual soldier encompasses a road, and you notice a motorcycle zipping towards you up that road. All right, it's coming at you fast. You yell real quick, "Hey, Sarge, like I got, this motorcycle approaching from, 342 degrees. It's coming in fast." That particular sergeant is particularly aware of motorcycles because he's been a victim of an SV bid before, a suicide vehicle-borne IED. He has been attacked by one of those before, and he knows that you're in a high suicide threat environment. You've been exposed to those before. They're in this area. And you've just been hit hard, and that sergeant just lost one of his guys. So he's not feeling great. You can't see a weapon from that motorcycle rider, but you're in a bad security posture. You're in a high threat environment. You've been attacked in this area before, and you know that complex ambushes are one of the enemy's tactics. You go through your escalation of force procedures. You shout, you shove, right? You're yelling, you're waving your hands, you're trying to get that motorcycle to stop. It doesn't. You look back again at your sergeant, and he yells, "Just kill him." You've been given a legal order in a high threat environment. You snap your rifle up, you see through your scope that this person is a military aged male, so between the ages of 18 and 45, and it's your call. What do? And keep in mind that if you don't decide to follow that sergeant's orders, and it is a suicide-borne vehicle IED, your whole squad could be dead. Take 2 minutes, think through this situation. Think through distinction, proportionality, the need to protect those and those around you, self-defense. What are your options? These are difficult. I'll put 2 minutes on the clock, and I want you to think about it, write down some answers. We'll talk about it. All right. Go ahead and wrap up your answers. So
Go ahead and once again have them type them out in the chat box, you think?
yeah, so if you like, you can type it out. I'd like to talk a little bit about it for a second as a group. And first off, just kind of hear where you guys are thinking here. What principles are you drawing on? Again, if you raise a hand, I can see you and we can chat. Talk a little bit out. To make it easy to start, what principles do you notice at play in this scenario? So we talked about 4: distinction, proportionality, accountability, and the rights of soldiers. Which one is kind of like the most prevalent here? Yeah, Jack.
I noticed proportionality because you have to decide whether it's worth it to shoot the man because he could be an IED bomber. So, yeah. And then I noticed last resort because your only option is to shoot him if he is an IED bomber because you got to stop him before he gets to.
Yeah. So a couple things here. One, first off, proportionality. So what is the action that I'm trying to make happen? And how much force do I need to use to make that action happen? What action do I want to happen here? Like, I'm a soldier. What do I want this motorcyclist to do? That's the most important thing. What do I want him to do? What action is he currently undertaking that I would like him to stop undertaking?
You want him to stop coming towards you?
I want him to stop coming towards you, right? That's the action that I'm trying to make stop happening right now. How much force am I allowed to use to make someone stop moving towards me?
I guess you're allowed to shoot him in this situation because that's the only thing you can really do to get him to stop moving towards you.
Sure. What else? So proportionality seems to matter. Yeah, Ben? Ben, you gotta unmute yourself, brother.
Oh, I did. I guess I didn't, but I saw at the end it said that he was wearing a military thing. Was that correct?
Nope, he's a military-aged male, which is a catch-all term we use to make it sound like it's okay when we kill people.
Yeah. Well, given that scenario, if the whole thing goes around the fact that he is a potential threat, there's like the distinction you don't really know, but because you've been waiting and trying to get him to stop, and he doesn't seem to be even slowing down, you can only really assume that he's trying to hurt you, but there's no real like distinction saying that he is trying to.
Sure. So we're going to move on because we only have so much time. If your name isn't Ben or Jack, why don't you go ahead and type out your response? That way I can kind of see them as they come in. So everybody else, make sure you type them in there. We've heard from Ben and Jack, so we're good. Get those messages up in the chat, and we'll kind of see what you guys were thinking. Distinction here, absolutely. Is this guy actually a legitimate combatant? And that's a question you absolutely have to ask yourself. Right now, I'm assuming based on his actions. We talk about actions based on, or force based on actions and force based on status. So if a person's wearing a military uniform, they're clearly like a lawful combatant. If you're wearing the uniform of a country, like, you are a lawful combatant, right? And so what you're doing at any given time, even if you're not engaged in a firefight, doesn't really matter. Like, you're a member of that military, you're kind of fair game, right? But when no one's wearing uniforms, you have to be doing something. There has to be some kind of action that person's taking that's putting me at threat. Right now, all this guy's doing is driving towards me at a high speed. So is he, based on his actions, a legitimate target? I have to make that distinction, right? I have to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Did this guy's actions rise to the level of making it enough for me to kill him? And I have a lawful order. I'll tell you what actually happened in this situation. It's one of my favorite stories to tell because I think it's an example of courageous restraint. This is a true story, and it's about, so we're coming up on the 8th anniversary of it. On April 11th, it'll be the 8th anniversary. So it was a guy in my platoon. His name was Ramon Kaipat. He was an immigrant from Saipan. He stepped on an IED and he was killed on April 11th, 2012. He was everybody's kind of favorite guy. So it was really tough. People were shook up. And a guy named Steve Medlock. I can say these names because you'll never meet him. Steve was this kind of crazy guy, a lot like a lot of you. He was young. He was about 19 years old, and he was wild. And none of us thought this is what would happen. And he got the order to kill somebody, and we thought absolutely he would do that. I watched Steve Medlock stand up and shoot 2 rounds nowhere near this guy, which is not allowed. You're not allowed to shoot warning shots because a shot might end up finding its way into somebody's body. So it's still technically deadly force. We typically don't want to shoot warning shots. But Steve, in this moment of kind of courageous restraint, where he had been the victim of that suicide IED bomb before on the motorcycle, he shot like 100 yards in front of this guy, and the motorcyclist realized really quickly he was coming 20 very angry, very sad U.S. Marines who were looking for an excuse to use violence. And he turned around and went away. So Steve Medlock absolutely saved that guy's life that day. In a really difficult scenario where Steve had literally only moments to think, and he chose really courageously to let this guy live at risk to himself, which I think is one of the most moral things you can do, to put yourself in greater risk, but to give somebody else, this poor Afghan farmer who never made any money in his life, an opportunity to live. So just remember that there are other options. We live in a world of infinite options, and some of them aren't always legal, but sometimes they're the moral thing to do, and we can make those decisions. There's always another choice. It's not always just, hey, like I have to kill this guy, even if a sergeant tells me that that's what I'm supposed to do, right? Like we have options, and sometimes they involve putting ourselves at risk. But sometimes that's the right thing to do, especially when you're a professional soldier, right? Who's a different kind of class of person than a civilian. We expect soldiers to do those kind of things. Let's go to the next scenario. And I'm going to read all of your responses. And I appreciate you guys thinking deeply about them. So in that next scenario, yep, I'm frozen again, so I've got to move over. Can you share that? Yeah. That's great. Oh, this is the, yeah, okay. I'll walk you through it. So you're on a patrol. You have this, here's what we had. We had a big blimp that had $1 million camera on it that could see for miles. It picks up these guys rolling out of a village that you've typically taken hostile act from. These guys all have weapons. They all have like RPGs, PKMs, like heavy machine guns, and rocket launchers, basically. And they start to maneuver against your patrol, trying to get into like an ambush site against about 20 of you. So they're armed. They're looking to do you harm. You get the jump on them because the ISR, the blimp, saw them. So you start maneuvering against them. You end up pinning them against a river. They can't maneuver anymore. They're kind of trapped against that river. And luckily this time, like last time, you didn't have air on station. Now you have planes involved. And your forward air controller calls in some airstrikes, kills some of them for sure. But after all that ruckus from the airstrike going off, in this case it was gun runs, big 30mm cannons, lots of people jump up. So you're proned out, you're laying down, you have like a pretty heavy duty rifle, and all these people jump up from behind a berm after like a big dirt thing, a big dirt obstacle. All these people jump up after that gun run goes off. And since those people were near these other people that had guns, you assume that it's the same people, right? You're looking through the scope of your rifle. You see one of these guys. He looks just like those guys. He's the right age. He's the right size. He's wearing this white thing. Your sergeant is calling out targets, telling you like where to engage and how to engage these guys so you can make sure to kill these people who just tried to attack and kill you. And he says, that dude in white. You look through the scope of your rifle, and through the scope of your rifle, you're unable to make out a weapon, but they're in the right place at the right time. Like this certainly seems like a legal scenario. It's too far to make out, I think it says there. But again, you've been given an order. What do you do? Take about 2 minutes, think through this situation, think through the principles. Okay, finish those thoughts up. Again, post them in the chat. I'd love to read them and see where y'all's heads are at. So make sure you get them into the chat. I will be checking them and reading them. I'd love to know your guys' thinking. Again, just the giveaway in this one, they're all kind of the same theme. After this, what happened is later, the next time this guy pops up, he's shielding a wife and a child with his body. So they turned out not to be a combatant at all. He was just in the vicinity. It turned out there were lots of farmers in that particular field when we called in that airstrike. And they were all very terrified because big bombing planes all of a sudden showed up. And they had nothing to do with the other people. And so that guy ended up being a non-combatant. So again, distinction matters. And we're gonna go ahead and skip the last scenario, but I'd love you to read it. It focuses really heavily on accountability. In some ways, it's one of the most difficult situations because it involves someone you know, and someone who's on your side who engages with a casualty. And again, this is a true story. And how do you hold your own accountable, especially when it seems like that person took their action to save other people? So in that same airstrike scenario, if you walked up on a dead body and someone shot that seemingly dead body, how would you deal with that? And what principles would it violate and why would it do that? Difficult. And it's a great, not just moral question, but kind of practical question for how you survive in a group setting when you rely on other people for help. So lots to think about there. I encourage you to read it, think about it. I'm sure Mr. G has my email address. So if you're interested in these kind of things, if you want to wrestle with these kind of things and you want to talk to me, please feel free.
And one other thing too is that their homework for tonight, they're going to reflect on what their main takeaway is today and then any other questions that they have. So if you'd like, I could even put your email in there and they could contact you and follow up on that.
Yeah, please. So my experience is going through all these things and moving me really towards an area where I really think about nonviolence as a really, as not just the ethical thing, but the practical thing, right? And the reading you did last night really makes that clear that there's two kind of objections to just war theory. And the first is that it's never moral. The use of force is never moral. And for me, for my own Christian faith, like I look at the cross and I see Christ crucified by professional soldiers like me. And it makes me really doubt the question of violence and the power of violence in the Catholic faith. A good friend and spiritual mentor of mine tells me that the power of violence is destroyed on the cross. And that my time in the military taught me to worship violence, but Christ teaches us the opposite, right? And that's my own ethical paradigm. That's where I fall. That's my own journey. That's how I kind of think about it based on my experiences. So it's never ethical to use violence. And then the practical matter is I've seen all these scenarios where it seems like war can be kind of perfected in a way where like we can make it really good and we can do it justly. We can act justly this time. But I've seen that in the reality of war and the fog of war, it's nearly impossible. And you will end up hurting innocent people and often creating and harming more than you could ever help. So it's really tempting to think that, right? Like we can do things the right way. We can use force to save people when that's so often not the case. And the collateral effects, the practical effects of force are so often worse than the problems that we created. And there's a whole host of examples. But having said that and told you where I come from, and you know now a lot about me and my own kind of wartime experiences, I'd love to know like what questions you guys have for me about what it was like, about maybe you have your own kind of ethical paradigm. Whatever you guys want to know, I'm happy to ask. I'm pretty open about these things. So yeah, I was a Marine for 5 years, and that's what I did. If I see hands or questions in the chat box, I'm happy to. Michael, yeah, go ahead, bud.
All right, so I was just wondering, like, the level of training of the people that you were facing. So yeah,
Not as good as mine.
mm-hmm.
That's the cocky answer. I mean, like I was really good. Like I was very, very good. That's so cocky, but I still have that like kind of like Marine sensibility to me where like if I was going to get in a gunfight, like nobody was going to be better than me. No, for the most part, these were, there's varying levels. So the guys who came out and wanted to play with us that particular day, they were pretty good. They were real Taliban, like they were paid professional soldiers. But they were joined by 6 to 10 like 17-year-olds, guys your age. And that's mostly who we killed that day, were like teenage boys with very little training, like stick an AK in their hand and tell them to go like mess with Marines. So then Al-Qaeda fighters, which are separate from Taliban, tend to be very good. Like they get training, not as good as like the United States military, right? I shot thousands and thousands of rounds and had like the best food and the best equipment and the best, like the great war chest of America opened up for me. So nowhere near comparable, but like better. And fighters in Afghanistan tended to be much better than those in Iraq. There's a famous study from 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, that 90% of the rifles in Afghanistan were found on single shot, not on automatic. And that means that the enemy were taking their shots and using like fire discipline and being very careful and actually trying to kill people and not just kind of spraying and praying and what we call like death blossoms. That's a good question. Thanks, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Hayden.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, like, did you ever have to like deal with one of these moral dilemmas in like a wartime, and how did you like respond to that in times of like stress and stuff?
All three of these situations are real from my life. So the first one, I was in that patrol next to Steve. So I was there. That wasn't my sector of fire, so I didn't pull the trigger. The second one is me. I did not shoot that guy in white for a lot of reasons, one of which is I was a coward at the time. I just didn't quite want to. And then I felt very relieved when he popped up and he was guarding a woman and a child. And I'm glad that I don't have that on my conscience. And then the third one is a real scenario I encountered where, yeah, there was a guy who may have been injured, may have been dead. I wasn't really sure. And then my staff sergeant shot him a couple times with a pistol because he had been through some things and he had seen dead soldiers be booby traps before. So I was constantly confronted with real ethical dilemmas. There's 100 others in here that don't make it into it. It's hard. Sometimes I acted in ways that I'm proud of to this day. Sometimes I acted in ways that I'm very ashamed of to this day. We call that moral injury. And it's something that's difficult. On the whole, like looking back, I'm pretty, not ashamed, but I feel like great pain and sorrow for the pain and sorrow that I caused other people and for the violence that I took part in. It's hard to know that you were the cause of death for other people. But at the time, you're a U.S. Marine, you're surrounded by people that you love deeply. That like brotherhood of arms is very real. So you rely on them. They're your support network. They help carry you through those things. In the time there, you fall back on your faith. You fall back on like the lowest common denominator. So the things I learned at SLU High were absolutely like going through my head, the books that I read in those moments, believe it or not. And then afterwards, you find whatever support networks you can. I met a couple of great priests and a couple of great religious folks who really helped me make sense of it all. But in the heat of that moment, you're really thinking about like the people next to you and how to keep them safe. And that doesn't always lead to great moral decision making, right? Like it tends to be kind of selfish and you tend to cut other people off because you're not recognizing the humanity of other people. You're only thinking about yourself and the people around you. And in some ways that's wrong. Like we want to call ourselves to a greater humanity like that of Christ on the cross, who said like, who thought about the people who were hurting him, right? Like he had the humanity and the divinity to think about the people who were like nailing him to a tree, right? So why am I called to do any less just because a guy's driving at me with a motorcycle? Why don't I consider his humanity? You know, it may be okay, it may be morally justified to use self-defense, but does that mean it's the highest form of morality? I don't think so. So yeah, other questions?
Well, I want to interject and honor everybody's time. It's 2:00. So if people need to go, you're welcome to go, and you can certainly wrap up the day by completing that exit ticket. But I want to thank our guests. Wonderful work that you put in as far as putting together the scenarios, going through the lesson plans, and just answering. I really appreciate it. But please, if you have questions, stick around, and then be willing to answer those for us. So thank you.
Sure. And thanks, guys. I appreciate you taking the time and going through this stuff with me.
Anybody have any questions that they want? Yeah, Jack, go ahead, unmute.
you know, yeah. Oh, are there still hands? Yeah, if you guys just, there's very few people anymore, so you can all just go off mute and just, if you have anything, I'm happy to talk.
Yeah.
I actually have a quick question.
Yeah.
So how does like in your Marine training, I think, how do they those when you go through that?
But if that's Aiden, I just can't hear you, buddy. If you want to type it, you can.
I think that was Andrew, and he's coming back on.
Oh, okay.
I think he accidentally turned himself off. Ben, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, go ahead, bud.
Alan?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Firstly, I wanted to say sorry for showing up late.
It's okay.
My house is dying with the Wi-Fi right now. We had to restart it 3 times yesterday. But I'm glad I got to work, and I wanted to. So I had the main question was just, I have a cousin he's in the Air Force right now, and he doesn't really tell me a lot about what he does, and I feel like that might be something that maybe like he's like maybe ashamed of some of the stuff he does. Like if he's having a moral dilemma. Do you think that could be possible?
Yeah. First of all, yeah, thanks. How old's your cousin?
Oh, he's in his 20s. He has a family. He has a daughter.
Oh, nice. How old? So you've got well, it's your cousin, so it's a second cousin, right?
Yeah, my family. They had I have a lot of older cousins, and I came in way later, along with my brothers.